All right. Today we're going to be talking about how government is corrupted in the United States in the late 1800s on all levels, from the city council level and the mayor, all the way up through the states, the federal government, and even the presidency of the United States. And a lot of the corruption that emerged after the Civil War was very closely connected to industrialization. So we're going to go through some of the details. We're going to talk about the cycle of industrialization, how it becomes increasingly powerful as the 1800s goes on, and then how corrupting political influences use the vast wealth gained to try to get government power and keep it through basically kind of conspiracy amongst themselves to pretty much run government for their own profits. And then we'll talk about some reform movements and even some reform movements at the presidential level, so the highest levels of the federal government, how they tried to fix things. So that's where we're going today. Let's see. Industrialization, as you can tell at this image, was a pretty ugly thing in a lot of ways. And we detailed a lot of those problems already in the previous industrialization lecture and industrial labor. The pollution was absolutely horrid. The wages and the working conditions for the industrial workers was equally horrid. And there was very little government support systems or government control systems to stop or even inhibit pollution very much at all, or to help workers, or to tap the profits of large businesses and corporate executives to gain enough government revenue to actually do something about these problems. So this is pretty epidemic type of stuff. And it's cyclical in a lot of ways. So you have industrialization that basically kicks off immediately after the Civil War in a lot of ways, in the late 1860s. Even as Reconstruction and the problems of political Reconstruction is going, and economic and social Reconstruction is going, industrialization is kicking off. And industrialization demands some capital investment to build the factories and the machines, but on the secondary level, it demands low-wage workers, because that's where the businesses will make a lot of money. So you need a large labor pool, basically unemployed people that need work and are willing to take fairly low-paying jobs for industrialization to really work at its beginnings. And we see this in all different countries. First in Britain in the early 1800s, then in France and in Germany. And as industrialization spreads, this is basically one of the systems that helps it spread rapidly. And we're seeing that also right now in the major rising industrial powers of today, namely China and India, and other places like Brazil. So the United States itself filled a lot of its industrial labor supply from people that moved into the United States from other countries. And that's a fairly popular thing to do in the late 1800s. The United States undergoes a dramatic immigration boom from especially about 1880 until the outbreak of World War I in Europe in 1914. 1/3 of the Jewish population moves from Europe to the United States in those decades. That's a giant amount of people. A lot of them coming from Central Europe. Before the Civil War, most immigration into the United States was coming from Britain. And then during the Irish potato famine, the Irish started coming over in droves in the 1840s. They came over from France. They came from northern German areas that had more cultural connections to kind of British culture. But they were coming from places that had connections to British culture and British language, and a lot of time they knew how to speak English. So there was a lot of looking down on new immigrants in the run-up into about the 1850s, but it wasn't as bad as what happens after the Civil War, starting really getting going big time in the 1880s. Immigration, especially after the Civil War, shifts from what we would call North and Western Europe to South and Eastern Europe. So after the Civil War, you get a lot more Italians, a lot more people from what we call in Europe the Balkans, Southeast Europe, Romania, areas that will become Czechoslovakia quickly. People who don't really have many cultural connections to Britain and don't speak English in almost any way. So you get a lot of people coming into the United States that are real cultural foreigners, and a lot of native, as what you would call native white-born American citizens. They don't like a lot of these new immigrants coming in, especially when the immigrants refuse to learn English and they want to stay on their own kind of ethnic enclaves. And they go into cities like New York City creates a little Italy where Italian is spoken just out on the streets and Italian newspapers are printed, all that kind of stuff. That offends a lot of English-speaking Americans who are born in the United States. And they very much look down on these new immigrants. But the immigrants came in, and because they are largely kind of socially ostracized, a lot of businesses didn't really trust them to hire them very much until they agreed to work for dirt cheap. So immigrants are coming in, and as immigrants do today, they tend to go into the biggest cities to find jobs, to make some amount of money and hopefully bring the rest of their families over from wherever they're from. So a lot of these immigrants are going into the biggest cities, which if you ever look at population statistics and even maps of these cities, as cities grow, they swell in population. We call this the urbanization effect. And the late 1800s is where really you get the biggest American cities growing and becoming kind of industrially modern. This is where cities start bringing in so many people so quickly that they have to develop citywide, rational, planned sewage systems, firefighting systems, policing systems, trash collection, all the kind of daily stuff that you need for a city to survive without, wallowing in its own filth in a lot of ways. This is where they start creating a lot of better public transportation system, like the bridges we've talked about already. And they do it on a systematic basis. A lot of cities are replanned and rebuilt in a lot of ways to provide the infrastructure for people to actually survive in these cities. And we've already talked about the building of skyscrapers and the building of apartment complexes that will grow very large vertically, going up into the air. And this is the era where you get skyscrapers, because places like New York City and Boston, they're already surrounded by houses in the countryside around the kind of downtown areas, so they have to build up instead of out. And the only way they can accommodate this massive new population is to build bigger buildings. And the more you get urbanization, the more you get people crushed together, the more you get a demand for more efficient housing, more efficient transportation. Eventually, when electricity comes about, they start creating electric lighting systems for the cities to be lit at night so that people can also work at night and move around. So you get a new wave of industrialization. And you can see what this leads to. It's a self-perpetuating cycle. Industrialization demands immigration, which leads to urbanization, which demands increased industrialization, and it goes on and on and on and on from there. You have to figure out more efficient ways of food production to feed all these new people, to get them clothes, to get them shelter, to give them what we would call public works, plumbing, electricity, trash collection. And it goes on and on. And this was shocking to a lot of people who were born, say, in the 1840s or so, in the earlier United States that didn't have a whole lot of these kind of industrial systems. And within their lifetime, they go from really a pretty rural economy, agricultural-based economy, to being the industrial powerhouse of the world by the time they get into their 70s or 80s in the 19-teens, 1920s. This literally happens in one person's lifetime. So generations are being raised with this massive psychological change, and a lot of people really struggle with it. So questions about any of this so far? Pretty straightforward. Alrighty. City governments are becoming increasingly important because it's largely the city governments that have to deal with these new populations and figure out more rational, more efficient ways of providing for them. And of course, the biggest cities had the biggest budgets because they had the most people, they had the biggest tax base, and they had the biggest responsibilities. And by far the biggest city in the United States becomes New York. Secondary cities are places like the old American cities from the coastline: Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston in the south, New Orleans in the south. They remain the largest cities in the country. The newer cities that really developed with the railroad boom and the expansion westward become new industrial cities that are literally built up out of nothing with factory systems. Places like Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Columbus, Cincinnati, a lot of especially the Midwestern towns. So these cities' leaderships become important places to get your friends if you own a business that wants to, get a government contract. And individual business owners united together in certain cities, in individual cities, to get their own members, the members of their own little club and their friends, into government office on the city level, city council, the mayor, those types of things. So they get together and they raise money from their businesses and their friends because, just like today, usually the candidate who spends the most money wins the race, wins the election. And we can, again, prove that statistically. Today it's about 90% of elections in the United States are won by the candidate or the campaign that spends the most money. So if you are running for, say, mayor of New York City, you have a group that is working for you and that you are usually a member of actively, usually a group of wealthy business owners who pool their money to get you into office as their nominee. And these become known as political machines. They raise money to get their friends into office. They usually attach themselves to one of the two major parties, either the Republicans or the Democrats. So both parties are hugely corrupted by these machines. So if they win the campaign and they get their person into, say, the mayor of New York City, then the winner of that race goes into office owing his friends favors who gave him money to run in the first place, right? So when that person goes into office and that person has a lot of political appointments to make, say like head tax collector of New York City, people that are going to oversee security for the Port of New York, who's going to run the trash services for the city, has a whole bureaucracy to appoint below the mayor level. They tend to appoint their friends and their big political donors. So you get epidemic corruption because a lot of those appointees get appointed into offices that are supposed to oversee their own businesses. So if you run a trash collecting company and you've given the mayor who just got elected a bunch of money to get elected, he may make you the government bureaucrat that is in charge of all tax or all trash collection. So when the contract comes around and you are now in a government position to decide which company will get the government contract to collect all the trash in New York City, guess which company you pick? Yours or your friends. And do you pay yourself or your friend a little bit of money to just barely make a little bit of profit to collect all the trash in New York? No, you give them a ridiculously bloated contract, which basically takes taxpayer money and just shells it out to their friends. Or, in another way, you can take your salary as a government employee and then give it to the machine that put you in the first place. Because these guys are office holders. They make money. They have a government position. They get a government salary. And because a lot of them are rich anyway, they just take that check they get from the government as a paid employee and they just funnel it toward the machine to win the next election. Or if you are the trash collecting overseer and your friend's company has the contract and they start doing a really bad job of actually collecting the trash, are you likely to force them to do better? No. Because they're your friends and you are in a position, you're only there to guarantee that they make money. And this is how you get bloated contracts, government waste of resources, and usually pretty pathetic government services. even though the government is spending money hand over fist to get the best, most efficient service possible, the corruption kills it. Does this still happen today? Yes. In the past decade, the United States spent $1 trillion trying to rebuild Iraq. And they didn't. And there's a really good article that just got published today on by a U.S. diplomat who was in Iraq until, I believe, 2008. So he was there for the first 5 years as one of the people supposedly overseeing all this money being spent to, say, give Iraq an electricity grid. And it failed miserably. And his argument is that all that money was basically wasted. The United States did not really rebuild much of anything effectively for the long term. Why? Because you had corrupt officials in office that were giving bloated contracts to do virtually nothing. And the details of it, well, if you ever read into it, it's pretty disgusting in a lot of ways. So a lot of this same stuff is happening still. And when they're using their revenue to influence the next election, guess what? The political machines get the money. They either try to get their mayor reelected to make sure that they continue getting the power of all those bureaucratic appointments, or if the mayor or anybody in the government starts to resist this corrupt machine system, get rid of them. You support someone else in the next election. So if any of these candidates or any of these office holders ever exert real independence in the interest of running a good public service for the people, the machine ostracizes them. The corrupt leaders kick them out. So you get kicked out of the big club that basically runs things. And this is epidemic. And there's all kinds of ridiculous stories about mayors accepting literally suitcases full of cash in their office to ensure the loyalty of certain people in the machine or to win the next election. There are no laws to stop this. Because who's going to write the laws to stop this, right? The politicians in the legislature would have to write the laws, but if they're already corrupted, they're not going to do that, right? So it would take a large kind of social movement of the voters or the people to try to do something about this. And that movement gets started pretty quickly in the 1870s when this really gets pretty bad. There is a kind of grassroots movement to do it, but it takes certain tragedies, certain real social tragedies to gain enough public awareness to, get some kind of law passed. So questions about this at all? In political terms, ever since ancient times, we have called this patronage, which means there is someone up on high, not always in office, but usually the big money people who determine who gets into office. They are the kind of ones holding the strings. They are the puppeteers. And oftentimes the elected officials are really just kind of placeholders. They are figureheads. And as much as they talk about wanting to do great things for the country or the city or whoever they represent, they cannot go against their big financial backers, or else they'll be kicked out. And when a scandal hits, everybody points at the mayor and says, it's your fault. And the mayor points at the next guy and says, oh, it's not my fault. I appointed him to do that job. And so they just kind of point at each other. And that's what this cartoon is representing. When a scandal hits, everyone points at the guy next to him and says, and blame him for it. And if the machine really dominates the politics of this, then no one's ever really punished. Because why would you punish your own supporters? Give them a little fine or something like that. Does this happen today still?
Yes.
Yeah, without doubt. There is a company called Bayer that makes like kind of aspirin type painkiller stuff. About a year ago, it was revealed that one of their plants had accidentally infected a whole lot of their product. Their factory had infected their little pills with HIV. Whoops, who knew? The company knew, but they didn't want to take the loss of not actually selling that stuff. So they took it out of the American market secretly, shipped it to Europe, and sold it there. And the Europeans recently fined Bayer, or whatever parent company owns Bayer, for a corrupt practice, for endangering the lives of people. The fine, though, was so little that it was only a small proportion of the profit that the company made off of selling the stuff in Europe in the first place. And nobody went to jail. So is there any pressure on these companies to actually stop doing this? No. And you can say the same thing with this mortgage foreclosure crisis that's hit the United States since, 2007? We're 5 years into this. Have any of those Wall Street types of people or any of those big bankers gone to jail for, destroying the world economy? No. In fact, it's the people who protest against this stuff are the ones that are going to jail. That's what happens when you get corrupt politics. The rich, even when they're caught doing this stuff, if there's not a real threat against them, they will keep doing it. Which goes back to my original theory. If you have laws on the books and you don't enforce them, the people will do whatever they want. It's a lawless place. Just like the freeways that say 65 miles an hour, and it's a lawless place. Because I drive 65 way over on the right side of the freeway, fearing for my life on a constant basis. Okay, so questions about this idea of patronage. And we can pull many, 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 many different examples from even recent U.S. history of all this stuff. Okay. The best way obviously in a democracy, the best way to win office is to get more votes than your opponent, right? That's how you win elections. You guys are aware of this democracy theory thing? Okay, that's good. The wave of immigrants coming into these cities represented a great opportunity for machines of both parties, Republican and Democrat, to take advantage of these incoming waves of people. So the machines, the Republican and Democratic machines, especially in New York City, set up voter registration offices in the very place where people would go to register as an incoming immigrant to become a citizen. You would become a citizen in one room, and right down the hall there was a Republican Party voting registration line. And the guy who really figured this out ran a place called Tammany Hall, which becomes a center of machine politics. At first it was one of the centers of immigrant processing in New York City. And they gave him one little office in there because he said he wanted to register these people to vote. Eventually his office grew to the point he took over the whole building. So Tammany Hall became symbolic of New York City machine corruption. And its leader, the guy who ran it, was named William Tweed, and they called him Boss Tweed, as they did in many different cities. The person that's really at the height, the very top of the machine, that's really giving out all the orders and making sure that they have certain candidates running for certain offices, making sure the money is raised and the promises are kept. They are usually called bosses. These guys usually are not the mayors. They very rarely accept a position in the bureaucracy. So they're out of office. But they are usually the big decision makers. They're the ones that guarantee that the money flows. And Boss Tweed was hugely powerful. It is said that he ran New York City, even though he was out of office for many years. And he is only taken down by a New York City cartoonist who published cartoons in New York newspapers, because a lot of these incoming immigrants couldn't read, and a lot of Americans even by this point couldn't read. So the best way to attack him was through images instead of words, instead of big essays that would detail all the corrupt aspects of his operation. Just put it into images, emotional images, and there's a whole slew of these cartoons going after Tweed that eventually reveals him as corrupt. And he was a fairly large person, so he was portrayed symbolically as being overly greedy. So this cartoonist named Thomas Nast went after him in really one of the best cultural ways possible in a fairly uneducated society. Another one that shows, put up the good, honest, upstanding face of the mayor. Usually the candidates for office are squeaky clean, right? Because you don't want to run a candidate who might have some skeletons in his closet, some secrets or something, or some secret corruption that no one's ever heard of. because when he runs, he's going to be investigated. So you look around, you find people that have a good image, and you put them out front while the people actually running the machine stay in the background. And this is an image, it's kind of pixelated, but the mayor's face, the good, upstanding, trustworthy guy, is kind of the facade. And in the background, you have a bunch of kind of shadowy people going into a box called the city treasury. And again, it's symbolic of the fact that they portrayed themselves as upstanding and honest, and the Republican and Democratic parties on the city level and the national level said that our party is the one that is going to fight corruption. And that's how they win elections a lot of times. They advertise themselves as being anti-corruption kind of missionaries. But once they get into office, it's the same old story. If any of that sounds familiar to you. More of the cartoons. The whole city under the boss's thumb, literally. And this is supposed to be the tiger of Tammany Hall ripping apart the population, ripping apart all public services. Finally, Tweed is arrested for corruption, for basically waste of government resources, and certain kinds of bribery. But this cartoon is important because, again, he got a slap on the wrist. Because he controlled the people that were enforcing the law and making the decisions about how much jail time to serve and all that. Basically, his political career is destroyed. So he's knocked out of the machine, but he's already made enough money to live fairly comfortably. And even in this image, when they go to arrest him, he kind of has this look on his face, turns around and says, "What, you're actually going to try to arrest me? What kind of guts do you have?" And the policemen are showing up like, "Well, we're really hesitant to do this, but we're told we're supposed to arrest you today. We hope this isn't an inconvenience for you." And the image up above looking over is the kind of 1800s ideal of justice. And, with a pretty disgusted look on her face. So that's the kind of short history of Boss Tweed. And he's eventually taken down through this kind of media campaign against him. And you see the exact same kind of media campaigns going after candidates today, right? Advertising is probably going to win the U.S. presidential election and almost all the federal elections. Our elections are run by the advertising industry. That's it. So it's the same kind of image wars that they use. And if you pay close attention to a lot of those ads, when it's a supportive ad for a certain politician or a certain idea, you hear the nice kind of piano music about everything's all nice and calm and beautiful and optimistic. And when they portray the other candidate or the other idea, you get the dark music where everything starts crashing apart, and you see these ridiculous kind of black and white images of the other person, right? You're familiar with these? And usually when they show the supportive stuff, it's like the person walking through the sunshine, nice and strong and confident. All right. But Boss Tweed was just one of many. Some of them are taken out through media campaigns. Boss Tweed was the most famous. He was in the biggest city and tended to have a huge amount of control. So he becomes symbolic of the movement to take these kinds of guys out. But even when you get rid of a boss, another one just rises to that level. Right? So even though you knock out individuals, you don't get rid of the core corruption, the major problem. And this was a problem going all the way back to the end of the Civil War, and even in parts of the Civil War, when the northern government was spending money to win the war, they gave contracts to gun makers to make rifles, and some of those companies didn't operate all that efficiently and kept a lot of profit for themselves. So this is an old story. This kind of stuff goes all the way back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. This stuff happens in government unless people do something about it. And the ancient Greeks, if you ever studied their democracy system for voting and juries and whatnot, went to great lengths to try to ensure that there wouldn't be any corruption or any bribery. But that's largely other classes. So this story goes way back in U.S. history and world history and human history. So President Grant was the first elected president after the end of the Civil War. The war ended in 1965. The next presidential election happened in 1968. Grant was the big symbolic general of the North who took up kind of national leadership of the Republican Party after Lincoln's assassination. And Grant was elected president in 1868, fairly easily. Grant had the good, trustworthy image. But he was corrupted. He, at the very least, had an inability to appoint trustworthy people into federal government offices. And Grant's administration, his presidency, is largely a history of one scandal after another, where it is revealed that his high political advisors and leaders, all the way up to people like Secretary of Defense, are taking money from individual companies in corrupt bargains, corrupt deals, and bribery. So Grant is unpopular, even as he goes for his first re-election in 1872, and he barely is re-elected. So just within 4 years, the corruption is so evident that he just barely squeaks out a victory and is re-elected just 4 years after he really rolls pretty easily in 68. He is so unpopular in the next election, 1876. He has ideas about running for a third term. But he is so unpopular because of all these scandals that the Republicans just ditch him. That's it. He's kicked out. And they nominate another Civil War general from the North named Hayes, and he runs. We talked about that election where Hayes had to make a bargain with the Southerners, right, to get the presidency because it was such a close vote. So Hayes goes into office basically as a kind of bastard president, a president that a lot of people didn't trust to have actually won the election. So there's a lot of doubt about his capability to actually lead the government. Hayes, though, goes into office, and he does appoint some fairly good people, and he takes major steps to try to end corruption on the state levels also, and all the way down into the cities. So he's a Republican also, and he goes through the Republican hierarchy and tries to knock out the most corrupt people in it, all the way down to the city level. So Hayes did do some things. And one of the more corrupt members of the Republican political machine in New York City was a guy named Chester Arthur. He became quartermaster during the Civil War in New York, which means he was responsible as a part of the U.S. Army to gain resources, to buy resources for the Army within New York City and send them to the national armies. After the war, in Grant's administration, he became the collector of the Port of New York City, which is a hugely powerful position. It's kind of one of the head tax collecting positions in New York City at the time. So he and his friends got into office through political machine tactics on the New York City level. And he ran that tax collecting bureaucracy pretty inefficiently. He eventually appointed more people into office, far more people into office than were actually necessary for collecting taxes. So it looks like he's creating new jobs for his friends, which is pretty obviously corrupt. So when Hayes goes into office in 77, 78, as Hayes is going through the Republican hierarchy all the way down to the city level trying to knock out the most corrupt examples of people that are attached to the Republican Party, he picks out Chester Arthur and knocks him out. Forces Arthur to resign. So Arthur is disgraced and goes into 1878, 1879, 1880. Basically retired politically. He's not in office anymore. But he keeps up his contacts. He still talks to his friends in the machine and in the city government. And he's looking for an opportunity to get back into politics eventually. So he understands that he's been kind of blacklisted for a little while, but the public has a short memory, right? Even today, a lot of politicians are talking about drilling for as much oil as we can get to, even way out in the oceans. Just 2 years after a giant oil volcano erupted in one of the oceans and poisoned an ocean even to levels we still don't understand. People have a short memory, especially the mass public, and especially when they're unemployed. So Arthur kind of accepts his punishment, his ostracism for the short term, understanding that in a few years he can probably come back if he just keeps quiet about it and just keeps talking to his friends that are in power. And the 1880 presidential election is a giant problem for the Republicans. Republicans have been in the White House since 1869. I mean, this is 12 years of Republican rule on the federal level. And they haven't been able to knock out corruption because of the machine style of politics. So the American electorate, the American voters, are pretty angry and are talking about changing parties, electing other people into office. So Hayes is so unpopular by this point for making the deal to become president in the first place. Republicans don't want him. Grant talks about coming back for another run at the presidency in 1880. He's untrustworthy because of all the scandals. So the 1880 Republican convention, the same convention that's happening right now, where today they chose their candidate, if you didn't read. Romney was appointed. He was nominated the official candidate of the Republican Party. They hold delegate votes, delegates from all the states who show up to cast their vote for who should be their nominee. And they deadlock one after another between Grant and Hayes. It's something like 26 different votes are taken, day after day after day. And neither Grant nor Hayes can actually get a majority enough to win the nomination. So eventually a third candidate kind of rises up as a compromise candidate that Republicans will try to get behind. This guy's name was Garfield, and he was governor of Ohio, I believe, at the time. And he was a reform-minded person and had done some things in Ohio to try to knock out corruption. So he's a kind of third choice that sometimes rises when the first two choices, neither of them can get a majority. So people get frustrated and they start turning to other options. Garfield is not really much of a national candidate, though. He's popular in Ohio and in parts of the Midwest, but he is really an almost unheard of national candidate for federal office. So Garfield's campaign knows that this is going to be a very difficult and close election in 1880. And that New York State is the most populated state at this point, therefore the most important to win. And it's very close in New York State also. So Garfield looks around for someone that is attached to the Republican machine in New York, and especially New York City, because that's where most people in New York State live. And he and his campaign pick out Chester Arthur to become their vice presidential nominee. A person who has really never held federal or state office. He's a city-level politician. But he had enough contacts throughout the city that he gets New York City to vote for the Republicans. And therefore they carry New York State and they win the election. A very, very close election again. And Garfield becomes president in 1881. Back then, like today, their federal elections are held in November. Back then they didn't inaugurate the new president until March. Today we do it in January. But back then they didn't do it until March. So Garfield becomes president in March of 1881. Arthur is the VP. And Garfield has to make a whole bunch of appointments to, the people who gave him money to run for the presidency. One particular person who gave money and worked on the campaign expected a pretty good office in the White House and appeared to be a little mentally not all there, and became angry when Garfield said no and, don't come back, stop asking, you weren't all that important. So this guy who feels very rejected and frustrated and angry decides to do something about it, so he packs up his gun and walks behind Garfield one day in Washington, D.C. and shoots him in the back, thereby killing him. And Garfield becomes the second assassinated president in U.S. history. And now you have what could be a big problem. The big reform-minded kind of president is gone. The VP ascends and becomes the president. The VP is the creation of corruption. He is only put into office through corrupt practices. And everybody in the country knows it. Yeah?
Wait, who shot him again?
This guy named, I think it was Guiteau, Charles Guiteau. And he is basically at least slightly insane. Thought he was far more important than he actually was and deserved a far higher office than he probably deserved in his work on the campaign. But this is also before the Secret Service is created, so the president's bodyguard isn't kind of a systematic thing yet. So and back then, the White House used to be open on certain days where you can just line up outside the White House and you can go meet the president and tell him what you think. So it was a pretty open kind of political system in some ways back then. And that assassin took advantage of it. But Arthur, and everybody knows it in the country, Arthur is the creation of corruption. He is the symbolic leader of corruption. He is only in office because he has corrupt business ties. And Arthur realizes that this is a problem at this point. And this is a point of national tragedy. People, this is a time of national mourning. People feel sadness because the president's been assassinated for what seems to be a ridiculous reason. So this is the one kind of major national event that can unify the people in a large outcry to change things, to try to eliminate corruption. Because obviously it's dangerous. It's destructive and dangerous. And Arthur shows himself to be a pretty powerful president, one that's largely forgotten today. But he does a 180. His whole life he had been in the machine system. And when he gets to the very top of politics in the United States, he starts attacking the machines. He turns on the people who put him in. And he pushes through legislation, through Congress, to try to eliminate corruption as much as possible. And the big act he gets passed is the Civil Service Act of '83. It took him 2 years to get it. So this does several things. Number one, it bans federal employees from soliciting or taking political contributions. So theoretically, if you are an official in the government, you are not allowed to take money from businesses. And this is where they set up their campaign committees to take the money instead. So they find a way around it. They find a loophole. So it's an attempt to end just the level of bribery where you walk into a congressman's office with a huge amount of cash and just hand it over and say, I want this law passed. Instead, you have to give it to their campaign committees and people who will run their re-election attempts, which is largely in a lot of ways what happens today. But it tries to eliminate a lot of the money changing hands directly. Another thing, it set up a civil service exam system. So if you want to go in and be a tax collector in New York City, you have to take a test, and you have to pass it to prove that you know something about math. I mean, who knew? You should know something about mathematics if you want to be an accountant. But that wasn't a demand in government at the time. If you want to be a government bridge builder, you should know something about architecture. Who knew? What a novel idea. So you have to have some kind of education. You have to have some ability to actually perform the job that you're trying to get. And you have to prove it by taking an objective, standardized test. And it set up a commission to create the test, administer the test, and oversee the results and make sure that people that aren't making the grade are not getting into office. And in a lot of ways that helps create, at least at the federal level, a federal bureaucracy that is much more professional and much more separated from the political machines than they were before. So this creates a fairly objective civil service that does its job on a much higher and more efficient level than ever before. So the law is pretty successful. And a lot of, especially the most corrupt people in government and in society and in business, did not like this law because it's taking their power away. And you notice that Arthur only gets one term in office. Yeah.
Did you ever talk about why he changed his mind?
Sadly, a lot of stuff, there's not a whole lot of history written on Arthur today. He was a kind of national figure in his time, but he is largely a forgotten person today. And it takes a pretty good amount of research to find out the details of a lot of this stuff. There's not even many major biographies written on him. luckily, one of the professors I ran into was an expert in late 1800s corruption and knew the story of Arthur pretty clearly. And that's where I learned all this stuff from. But there's just not a whole lot written on him. And who's the president that is mostly focused on in U.S. history? Yeah, Lincoln. There's supposedly, I've heard these statistics where supposedly there's just as many books being published on Lincoln as there are on Jesus, which is a big comparison. So Lincoln is the one that we largely look at. There's a lot of presidents that are fairly forgotten in U.S. history, especially by the mass population. And I would guess that if you went into a store or a Walmart or something and asked people, what did Lincoln actually do? And a lot of them wouldn't even be able to tell you. But that's the low level of our education, just kind of socially today. Other questions? Why did Arthur not run for a second term? Probably because he wouldn't have a lot of political support. He may have gotten a big vote because a lot of people liked that he was doing this stuff. But you need the money, just as politicians do today. There is also a lot of guesswork that he was ill, that he had developed an illness in his last year and a half or so in office, and that he knew that he was dying, so he chose not to run. But that's a much more difficult thing to prove. So he does not even go for a second term. He retires at the end of his first, and so you get other candidates that were run in 1884. Okay, so there's a huge amount of corruption in the U.S. government in the late 1800s, and it goes on. I mean, the Civil Service Act did not stop it all. It goes on, and there's another kind of mass rise of anti-corruption movement that starts taking place in the early 1900s, really right around the turn of the century, going into 1901, 1902. But we'll get to that in later lectures. But for the rest of this time in this session, I want to talk about real quickly some of the major kind of points of political debate in the United States in the late 1800s, and especially the 1880s. Probably the biggest one is the tariff. A tariff is a tax on imports. So if you have something like water bottles being made in France and shipped in the United States for sale, they are hit with a tax, an importation tax, usually based on the ton or the value of whatever you're importing. So if you have $100 worth of water bottles, once they come into port, they will be taxed at a certain rate. So if it's 10%, you pay $10. The support or rejection of tariffs largely fell along party lines. And Republicans want high tariffs in the 1800s. Because tariffs are created, and where they exist today, they are created to protect domestic businesses in a certain country. So if you're using the water bottle example, say France is importing or wine. If France imports $500 worth of wine and they want to sell it for $500 and you hit them with the 10% tax, the cost of that wine goes up to $5.50 because they don't want to pay the tax themselves. They're going to pass it off on the buyers, right? The consumers, just as companies do today. So their cost per bottle of wine goes from $5 per bottle up to $5.50 so that they can pay the tax through what you're buying, your purchase price. That protects U.S. winemakers because they don't have to pay the tax, so they can sell theirs at $5 a bottle. If you have comparative products, if they're basically the same, Walmart theory kicks in. If you have two things that are basically the same product, one costs $5.50, the other one costs $5, what do people buy? The one for $5 because people want to save money. Therefore, if you raise taxes on imports, the imported stuff gets sold for more, and the U.S. manufactured goods can get sold for less, and therefore people buy more made in USA type stuff and support U.S. businesses. That's the theory of high tariffs. And they call these protectionist tariffs because they protect domestic businesses. The Democratic Party largely complained about tariffs because they said, well, yes, you can raise tariffs on imports, and yes, that will protect U.S. businesses, But that also allows U.S. businesses to raise their price. So they're not going to sit at $5 a bottle because they know they can raise their price to $5.45 a bottle. They'll still be a little bit less, so people will still flock to buy theirs, but they have an increased profit, right? So the Democrats argue we should get rid of a lot of these tariffs, or at least lower them, because the higher you raise the tariff, you inflate the market price for goods. And that hurts buyers and the average voter, the average worker, because they have to pay higher prices for goods. So the argument goes, if you lower tariffs, supply and demand will kick in, and that will lower prices down to the point where people can actually afford to buy things. And this argument goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, throughout the 1880s and 1890s. And presidential candidates will rise, and one of them will become president basically based off the tariff argument. A guy who has advertised himself as an expert in the tariff policy. So this is a fundamental argument of that time. Another one is monetary. These did not fall according to party lines. There are Democrats and Republicans who support several of these different policies. Monetary policy means, what kind of money do you have? Literally, what does your US dollar or your cash represent? There was a policy at the time called the gold standard, which means your money in your pocket is worth something in gold. Back then, you could take $1, $10, $100, $100,000. You can take your paper money and go into a bank and say, put your paper money on the counter and say, I want that much in gold. And they would give it to you. It was an even exchange. Your gold or your money was tied to a certain value of gold, a certain amount. And they called it the gold standard. It was a very close relationship. And that tended to reduce inflation, because a government cannot print huge amounts of money unless they get huge amounts of gold to back it up somehow, real quickly, right? So inflation tended to be fairly, at least lower than it is today. Especially bankers and investment type people liked having the gold standard because it was a predictable money supply. Does that make sense? They don't want dramatic increases or decreases in the money supply because they're investment people. They want to know how much that money is worth, how much it's going to be worth in the future. They want it to be consistent. So most businesses, most big, especially financial businesses, supported the gold standard. Largely, average people did not. Because when you have low inflation, you tend to have fairly low economic growth. That's true today. Wasn't true, there wasn't as close in a connection back then because economic growth was just huge back then in the late 1800s because they're industrializing. They're becoming more and more efficient. So they're making more things, they're hiring more people, so there is growth regardless of the inflation rate. So a lot of average people are enjoying the benefits of economic growth. Well, when there's an economic crash, then they deal with the pain of it. But a lot of average people want more inflation, especially people who have mortgages, people who own homes or farms. Because if you get a fairly high inflation rate and you are tied into like a 30-year mortgage where you have a set payment every month for 30 years, say if you're out on a farm and your mortgage payment for the farm is $200 a month, and you sign that deal now, what happens if inflation starts to rise? The value of your crops goes up. So you can sell the same amount of crops for more money, right? More cash. Does that make sense? Therefore, in 10 years, if inflation keeps going up and you see your income go from like the $200 payment to like $1,000 a month, then you can pay off the mortgage easier. Does that make sense? So a lot of kind of mortgage holders and people that are ridden with debt somehow support what they call the Silverite policy, which was to remove money from the gold standard and attach it to silver because they're producing more silver. Silver is not as rare as gold. So that would inflate the money supply. Or the more extreme one said, disconnect it from both metals and just go to printing money itself, cash, and they call these the greenbacks. Just start printing money without any attachment to any of these minerals. Just print as much as you want, as much as society needs. So monetary policy is one thing that goes back and forth. And again, presidential candidates will rise based on being experts in monetary policy also. So these are huge symbolic and just central debates in U.S. national politics at the time. Yep.
How would you gauge how much the society needs?
How much money supply they need?
Yeah.
There's several different ways of measuring it. There's today we have things like the price index, inflation rates, the value of mortgages. There's a lot of different ways that economists have of trying to determine how much money should be out there in society.
Back then, with the population not exactly recorded, I guess, wouldn't they have the fear of...
Yeah, it's a much less exact science back then than it is today.
Yeah, so
put it that way.
Wouldn't they have a fear of printing too much money?
Yes, and there's a fear of printing too much money today, right? We saw that in the financial crash of 2008 when the government just printed about $700 billion and gave it out to rich people.
Right.
And a lot of politicians said, well, if you can keep printing money like that, you're going to cause massive inflation. Hyperinflation is what economists call it when it gets really out of control.
What's the argument back then for the greenbackers?
They want inflation to devalue mortgage debt.
Okay.
So the greenbackers are mostly popular in the Midwest or in the South, where there's mostly the big agrarian areas, where most of the farmers are. And where the big banks are in the big cities like New York, Boston, those types of places, they are usually much more kind of fiscally conservative. They don't want to change things, put it that way. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay. And the third major source of major debate is civil service reform. People understand their government is corrupt and they want it changed. So one after another, the presidential candidates, the people running for Senate and Congress, they have to take stances on these issues. And especially presidential politics in the late 1800s are usually very close. These are a series of very close elections. So most of the candidates and the people running these campaigns understood that the best way to maximize your vote and therefore win office was to spend a bunch of money. They didn't have, obviously, the kind of media advertising we have today with television, mass marketing and whatnot. So they built more local bodies to advertise politicians. They built city-level groups who would go out and stand on a street corner and scream about how great one candidate is over another or something like that. They bought up newspapers and printed huge editorials day after day after day, either supporting or attacking candidates. They threw giant parties, especially on voting day, to get their registered voters for their party out to actually the polls, and they would hand out free whiskey and all kinds of stuff just to get people there. And a lot of this stuff is pretty illegal today. Usually when you go to vote, you'll see lines drawn in certain areas where political representatives from parties cannot talk to you beyond a certain place, beyond a certain distance from the actual voting booth itself. So a lot of this stuff has been attempted to be wiped out, but obviously with the campaign system we have today that is run by advertisers mostly and major donors. You guys know Obama says he needs $1 billion to win this time, and he's been saying that for like 2 years. $1 billion. In the election of 2004, the winner won with $350 million. About a third of what Obama says he needs this time. And we already know that the Republicans are raising and spending even more than that in the few resources we have to actually track the money. So the great question is, did this reform actually work? In bits and pieces, but today it's largely been eviscerated. So we're largely seem to be going back to an era where big money wins campaigns, and we'll see what the results for public policy are.